Max Payne 4 is an unreleased third-person shooter video game that would be developed and published by Rockstar Studios were it ever made. The last entry in the series, Max Payne 3, was released back in 2013, and since then fans have wondered if Rockstar will ever revisit the series and why the series has been on a prolonged hiatus to begin with. So let's talk about why Rockstar decided to shelve the Max Payne series and if we should expect to see anything in the future. As always, all the sources will be linked in the description below, so make sure to check those out and support those original writers. And with that out of the way, let's get into answering the question of where is Max Payne 4? Let's start with discussing where the story of Max Payne 3 left off. So spoilers if you haven't seen the game yet, I guess, it is pretty old at this point. But basically the story of Max Payne 3 closed up most of the threads in the series and gave Max a fitting ending after following him for so many games and stories. In the end, he gets justice and literally walks into an actual sunset at the end of the game. And a lot of fans don't think that this story needs any continuation, that Rockstar knew what they were doing and knew that they wanted to end this story, which is exactly what we got in Max Payne 3. But of course, that hasn't stopped other fans from speculating what kinds of Max stories could be continued in potential future series. The first and potentially one of the more interesting ideas is a prequel. And I personally agree that a prequel route could be a more interesting way to add additional world building for this character, and it doesn't even necessarily have to be a prequel before the very first game. I've seen some focus on the idea of a prequel between the second and third games in the series. There's actually a 9-year time gap between these games, so there's still a lot of story that could be told within this time frame that would still allow Max to have his happy ending after the events of Max Payne 3. So there's really no end to potential stories that we could include, and this could even be a reboot if Rockstar wanted to take it that route. But basically the main takeaway is the story I think is finished, and it's assumed that Rockstar did this intentionally to let the franchise rest as they moved on to other properties. Which leads me to the next point: if the franchise was making money, there is no way Rockstar would shelve the franchise. And for all the goodwill the franchise did have with fans and critics, it really never materialized into game sales for the publisher, which is another big reason why this series was shelved, which is just due to the series sales, and it wasn't making enough money. Rockstar is usually secretive of the game sales when the game sales aren't good, but Take-Two in 2011 gave an update on some of their key franchises and how many copies they had sold. It was stated that between the first two games, the Max Payne franchise has sold 7.5 million copies, which essentially means about 4 million per game, which is not a bad number by any means, but it's definitely not what Take-Two was expecting. In 2004, the sales of Max Payne 2 were so bad, Take-Two blamed the company lowering their net sales by $4 million on the game itself. There were also a number of other factors, but they definitely said one of the more prominent in lowering this expectation were the lack of sales for Max Payne 2, The Fall of Max Payne. And it's a well-known fact that Max Payne 3 did not sell well either, even though it did have good word of mouth, good reviews, and a lot of fans had a lot of good things to say about it. But people often forget that this trend started actually with Max Payne 2, so the series has actually, for how popular it's been and how much goodwill it has with the community, has never really been the best seller for any company involved. And the only game that was truly considered a success for the company and the publisher was the original Max Payne released back in 2001, which leads us into the sales for Max Payne 3. So Max Payne sold about 440,000 copies in the United States in the first month post-launch. But this wasn't what Take-Two was projecting for the franchise. Analysts and industry professionals were originally anticipating about 600,000 copies for the debut month, and are now forecasting the game to sell about 4 million copies over its lifetime. So the game only sold 2/3 of what it was anticipated to, and was once again going on to sell 4 million copies over its lifetime, so just about the same as the first and second game. And normally 4 million copies would be a success for a lot of developers, but with a game that was originally set for release in 2009 and was delayed and not released until 2012 is a long time for development, and that can get very expensive, especially when considering it was most likely in pre-production well before 2009. And in 2012, Take-Two had similar feelings towards Max Payne 3 as the previous entries in the series. The CEO of Take-Two said, quote, "Not every title will meet our sales expectations. Although our first quarter results were below expectations due to lower than anticipated sales of Spec Ops: The Line and Max Payne 3. And the decrease in sales is definitely something that Take-Two had been watching. And while the sales of the series were fine, they were stagnant, which is usually a problem for these big companies. The fact the third entry in the franchise was still selling the same as the first and second games with very little growth is a problem, despite the change in the developer from the second to third game. And the last thing I kind of want to touch on with the sales itself is the current climate of games as a service, or microtransactions in games. Take-Two and Rockstar are no strangers to adding microtransactions into their games to get extra financial gain, but it just doesn't seem like it fits into the Max Payne universe, and I think all parties involved know it makes more sense to end the franchise at Max Payne 3 than continue the series and give fans the fourth or fifth game and anticipate low sales, but offset that cost with microtransactions in a traditionally microtransaction-free game. I think they knew it was better to go out with a bang and with the respect of their fans than run the series into the ground with potentially predatory microtransaction mechanics. And this kind of leads me into the developer changes the franchise has faced behind the scenes of the games. So the first two games were developed by Remedy Entertainment, who are known more recently for creating Quantum Break and Control. And the creative director at Remedy, Sam Lake, explained to Screen Rant why the studio worked on Max Payne 2 but did not return for the third title. He said, quote, "After the first game came out, the IP rights were sold to Take-Two and Rockstar, and part of that deal was an agreement that we would create the sequel. So, you know, with that understanding, it was a nice situation. We have a lot of passion towards Max Payne. It was wonderful to create that and to take certain ideas from the first one, and making a sequel is great fun in many ways. But at the same time, that was all with the understanding that this will be the final Max Payne game for us." And you could kind of go through that emotional process while working on it, saying goodbye. So from a creator's perspective, that was a really nice way to go. And this explains why the development for the third game shifted to an internal Rockstar game studio, which has to be a pretty dramatic change in development cost. When Remedy was developing the original or even the sequel to Max Payne, they were a relatively new studio and only had one game created before Max Payne, while Rockstar, on the other hand, is known for making amazing, huge AAA games, and the cost must have been so much more to get Rockstar internally to work on a project like this for Take-Two, which is why they have to anticipate higher sales, and why it'd be so much more expensive to have Rockstar make the game versus Remedy. And even Remedy now is a lot more expensive than Remedy was back in the day, so it's that fine line of finding a developer who can work on it with the caliber you want, but won't also make the production cost so high where they have to sell an obscene amount of copies. Which leads me to the last point I want to touch on in this video, which is the idea of a Max Payne remaster. If a Max Payne 4 is completely out of the question due to cost, low sales, and other problems, what if we can get a remaster for the games? I know a lot of people still say the game looks good for PC players, but there are a lot of console players out there, and a lot of the general gaming community as a whole could have a chance to revisit some of these games if they were optimized for newer consoles and just given a new coat of paint. Now, another reason this seems more possible than ever is because it will be the 20th anniversary of Max Payne in 2021. Which has already led to a lot of early fan outcry and support to potentially see a remaster of at least the original title, if not the sequel as well. Which could be a great way to not only give fans more Max Payne without creating a true sequel, but they could also build back up the Max Payne fanbase and gauge interest in the series again. Now, I know the chance of true remakes like Resident Evil is very low, but I think at least it could be a conversation, either a remaster, which seems more likely, rather than a remake, but I guess neither are completely out of the question. So what should we expect in 2021 and beyond? Well, personally, I wouldn't hold out too much hope to hear anything anytime soon on Max Payne. Deep down, I hope Rockstar does have some sort of release next year for the 20th anniversary, but it's usually never that easy or simple. And if that doesn't happen, there's most likely no chance of a true sequel coming out anytime soon, and I would expect a lot longer hiatus between the next game if nothing happens for the 20th anniversary. In a perfect world, I would want Rockstar to remaster the original 2 games, and then let another smaller studio work on the IP and potentially reboot the franchise. I think that'd be the most reasonable way to continue the franchise while still respecting the original trilogy that was created, and it would give fans the best of both worlds. If they wanted to play the original trilogy, they'd have this remaster, or if they wanted something new, there could be a new studio working on a reboot. Even though saying all of this, I'm still not personally expecting any type of announcement next year or anytime soon, but I would definitely be happily surprised if they did. And that, for the most part, is why we haven't seen Max Payne 4, low sales, changes in developers, higher development costs, a lot of delays for Max Payne 3, all of which cost a lot of money and led to a lot of problems behind the scenes. And they also really don't need to continue the story. They've closed it off, and I think a lot of fans are content with that. So that's where I'm going to end this video as well. Make sure to like and share, subscribe for weekly gaming news, and I will see you guys in the next one.